Good morning, everyone. My name is Stefan Vincent van Kuhn, and it's my great pleasure to moderate this session. I'm a senior analyst and deputy head of division at the OECD for Directorate for Education and Skills, and we'll have a great session today on generative AI and assessment. That has actually been one of the first big topics that we discussed when generative AI came out. As you may remember, a lot of the discussions were about cheating, the academic integrity of students, and that's actually one of the different aspects that we would like to discuss today. We have to keep in mind that assessment is about a lot of different things: formative assessment, summative assessment. It's about providing feedback to students, giving them assignments that they will actually sometimes do, at home. It's about trying to check in a more controlled environment where they have actually learned or what they remember of their learning. And also one of the things that generative AI can help do now is actually to mark and grade and think of, a high-stakes exam, and also to develop, this kind of assessment. So basically what we do today is try to discuss, and for that, there is a wonderful panel of experts to discuss these different topics. Well, they are all authors of the OECD Digital Education Outlook 2026 on generative AI, and very highly renowned experts on AI in education. And so we have today Inge Molina, who is a professor at Radboud University and the research director of NOLAI, the National AI Lab in the Netherlands. We have Dragan Gazevich, who is a professor at Monash University in Australia. Ryan Becker, who is also a professor at Adelaide University in Australia, and also the director of the Penn Learning Analytics Center, if I remember the name correctly. And Nico Rummel, who is a professor at the Center for Advanced Internet Studies in Bochum, and also at the Broad University Bochum. So thank you so much to be with us to kind of address that topic. And so I will just start and by asking you, let's perhaps start of thinking of the kind of academic integrity issue, and so how do we actually think of assessment when it's not in a controlled environment, and when people have actually access to generative AI tools, and actually how do you do it yourself, as professors, or what do you recommend people to do when they try to, cope with that issue? So who wants to start? Inge, perhaps I can start with you.
Thank you, Stefan, and thank you for the invitation. Yeah, this is definitely a problem that a lot of educators are facing today, and I think it might be one of the biggest challenges that we're currently having ahead of us. In uncontrolled environments, it's really difficult to distinguish between what the work of the student is and what the work of the GAI is. And in this space, we see that students are regularly offloading. So they're offloading both their cognitive activities, so what they need to learn, as well as their metacognitive activities, their monitoring and control. And this is really problematic. What we advise teachers to do is really think about the type of assignments that they're giving students and the space in which those assignments allow students to generate and actually require actual processing of the information and activities that go beyond what you can do with the large language models. I know this has limits, but this is something that educators and teachers can in fact do. And on the other side, really advise teachers also to discuss with their students what the value is of actual learning activities. We're not making instructional designs for students because we think it's fun to do. We do this because we want them to learn. And just making them aware of the fact that performance is not the same as learning, and learning really needs to be driven from an intrinsic motivation to acquire new knowledge and skills. And I think that is the conversation that we need to have with our students, because we can control it, we can regulate it, but at the end of the day, they need to become aware on how to engage in learning processes with these new tools. And we're all struggling in this space, but I think this is the most important discussion to have with our students.
Okay, who wants to add to that? Dragan? We cannot hear you.
Very happy to add there. And thanks, Inge, for bringing that distinction between learning and performance. That distinction existed in understanding of human learning for quite some time in educational psychology, more specifically, probably durable learning. In other words, what are those long-term learning gains versus what are those immediate performances, and the kind of the literature on cramming versus using more deep learning approaches that can be used is quite distinct and well known in the literature. However, the problem with generative AI, as you clearly pointed out, that decoupling of learning and performance is growing much more. And the issue is now that learners can perform, except that they are not performing in certain situations. So what's the problem with that? Well, some people can say, hey, but people need to learn to work with AI. We need to have hybrid intelligence. Well, hybrid intelligence is not that you just automate a task to AI. That's called automation. That also means if you only know to do just a little bit of that, or your ability is completely automated, that means you're obsolete as well yourself. I think that's the one first message that needs to be communicated to the learner. The second important message to the learner is that, and the educator as well, is that we need to think about how learners can be augmented with AI and how they can also achieve a certain level of synergy. Augmentation typically means that students working with AI can achieve more than what the learner can do it by themselves. And then synergy is how the learner plus AI can achieve better than learner alone or AI alone, right? So that's basically one important thing. So then we basically need to come to the important point that I typically like to make. I have a hypothesis that while for certain tasks that can be automated, AI can perform really well. If we want to achieve high level of synergy between human and AI, humans need to have high levels of ability. That really means also the position as well that Stefan, you discussed earlier with us, is that we need to have these two streams. We need to know what are the human skills and also how humans are behaving and performing in the tasks that are requiring the use of AI. Otherwise, the human abilities will not be possible. So then how do we assess human skills? Well, I mean, in certain situations, we need to resort to some of these well-established assessment approaches that can be typically done in a classroom, see what can be done. In other situations where we want to see this kind of hybrid approach, then obviously, what we can do with the current technologies that are available to the educators, we can do very quick spot checking for the learners to basically be able to defend their work, to also critique each other's work as well into certain situations. But where I personally would like to see and going forward is much more use of the process data. In other words, the learners are not submitting to you the product, what they created or what they filled, but also how they felt it. In my view, if you want to have a proper formative assessment, you can beat your final product as much as you want. But if you don't know how you achieve or what steps you took to get to that product, you cannot fix it. I usually like the metaphor of the athletes, those who are basically competing in different track disciplines in athletics. They don't just look what was their final time. They actually carefully look at every single on the way, for example, 100 meters, and then they are looking those specific steps where they can improve. Similarly, we as educators need to have these type of learning analytic technologies that can help both the learners to understand how they can improve their abilities, but us educators as well to know where the learners are.
Thank you. We'll come back to this idea of the process aspect and also the use of AI. But let's continue and hear what Ryan and Nicole have to say on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to add here. Maybe we're right now, I think, talking about situations where the learners can use AI. We're not talking about summative assessments, but more like formative assessments. And I think to make this a little more concrete, one aspect that is important and that can be useful for learners here is to experience the challenges of working with AI. And I think, so I'm a co-author on the chapter on collaborative learning with AI. And one possibility here is to let learners collaborate while they're using different generative AI tools, for instance. Because, I mean, this is one of the decisive aspects of this technology. It won't give you the same answer, depending on how you ask, depending on which model you use. And soon enough, the students will be challenged to evaluate and understand, not just go for quick performance and getting it right and submitting it, but to basically fight with each other and get into an interaction, trying to understand which is actually the right solution or what they should write and submit. And we've seen this in several sort of more project-based environments, learning environments. So I think this is a nice opportunity where we can allow students to gain experiences with these tools, and at the same time learn about their biases, their limits, and to challenge each other and to learn. And that's another aspect that's important to me, to acquire skills in arguing with each other and learning and together here, which is sort of well, I wouldn't call it a quick fix, but it's one of the approaches of how to avoid going for fast performance without thinking and without actually learning.
Thank you. Ryan, do you want to add?
Sure. It's hard to go forth after such a distinguished group of scholars having so many great points. I guess I'll just say that, I think Dragon's got a great point about how we can assess process. I think, Nicole has great points about I'm sorry, I'm tired, folks. It's late here in Adelaide. And I just spaced on what I was going to say, praising Nicole. But I think that it comes down to kind of, we need to support students in learning to work with technologies. We need to support them in becoming, there's a real question of what is the goal of learning in this era. We need to teach people how to be able to be prepared to work with the technologies effectively. We need to have assessment we can believe in to some degree. I tend to think that invigilation, kind of on an audit basis, is one of the ways to go, where we let people use the technologies to provide artifacts, but every once in a while we ask them, without the technology there, explain what you did, explain why you did this. If they can't talk about it, then they don't really understand it. And that's a good way to prove to them that they don't really understand what they're doing. Because part of the problem about AI dependency is that people don't realize how shallowly they're thinking. They don't realize how much it's taking over. And so we need people to have these experiences of being accountable and serious about their work. So to me, it's a matter of, we need to change what we're teaching, and we need to change how we're assessing it. The trick is that it's changing so fast that the approaches and techniques we develop today become obsolete tomorrow. Think about all the math. Think about the fact that there was, I think, a master's program in prompt engineering that popped up in 2023, like a fast-growing flower or weed, and immediately got chopped down by the AI, where prompt engineering is not the same thing it was back then. So I think that's part of the challenge. How do you teach for something that's moving so fast? How do you assess in something that's moving so fast?
Let me continue and ask a follow-up question to you, Ryan, because that's one of the things that you discuss in your chapter. When you actually learn computer programming, usually you have to use some of these tools, and so the idea that you're not going to use the technology doesn't make a lot of sense, and you have to. But at the same time, how does it relate to the learning goals, and how do you make sure that, there are, or how do you identify what are the core things that you really want people to know how to do? So my point I'm trying to say is that, how does this discussion relate to learning goals, So can we actually use, let's say, GenAI for things which are secondary to the main thing that we want the students to learn? Or do we actually, so how do we isolate these different aspects?
Well, if I might make an analogy in computer programming, there are still compiler courses at many universities, but people don't typically write their own compilers. They use the tools. We need to have a certain proportion of people who do understand that, but we don't need as many, you don't need people to be writing in assembly language the way you did in the early 1980s. Similarly, there may be a point where some aspects of the software engineering task, go away, and some aspects of it get enmeshed. We're already seeing that in people's work with Claude Code and with Codex. That said, one of the things I've noticed in working with junior colleagues is that I'm able to get better results out of a lot of these tools than they are. And that's because I still understand what's going on with the programming. I still understand how to debug. I still understand, how to check the code and see that it's not actually doing the stats, for example, for data science programming that we wanted to do. So it becomes a skill of recognizing and comprehension as opposed to recall and production. But it's still a skill. And so to me, it's a refiguring of that kind of approach. And in a course by course level, to go back to your question, Stefan, at a course by course level, in the introductory programming course, maybe we need them to be understanding things that they don't need to understand when they get to an advanced data science course. And at that point, we should be scaffolding the programming parts of it.
Okay. So I think that, just for everyone, the computer programming aspect is, well, a kind of a metaphor for all of the other possible subjects when actually there is a need to kind of do both, because I think it highlights kind of a common challenge of what is core, what do we want people to actually learn, and how they actually become sufficiently experts to be able to see the shortcomings of the AI, and I think that's one of the big kind of difficulties now as well, in redesigning the assessments. So who wants to add to that?
I wanted to emphasize a point that I was trying to make here earlier, that I think one very specific and practical thing that educators can do is to try to design for making this experience, that checking is important, that things go wrong, that they are unpredictable to a certain extent. And I think even with the models we have right now, that is still the case. And if we divide up tasks or if we design tasks in a way that they will need to learn these abilities that Ryan was pointing at, which involve revising, checking, debugging, checking for the shortcomings of certain answers. And I think that is an increasingly important, it was always an important aspect. As Dragan was saying earlier, we do have a lot of a solid basis in learning psychology and educational psychology that we can build on. So we shouldn't assume that we don't know anything about how people learn. We know a lot about how people learn, and we know a lot about how to design assessments that can challenge them to learn. I think we just need to think differently and maybe let go of some of the ways of assessments that have made it easy or that we're used to. I saw that there was a question from the audience talking about whether something is manageable in the educational system. And I think that's an issue that a lot of educators are experiencing right now, because if you give these creative assessments and then they go home and they use AI, well, how do you make sure in the classroom, you can't have an oral presentation by everyone if you have 30 kids in the classroom. And that's exactly why I was pointing at, for instance, collaborative learning setups. But I'd also be interested to hear from the others, because I think that is really sort of a second issue here. How can we, even if we design tasks that allow the learners to experience the challenges and the shortcomings and to become good debuggers, but how can we check for that knowledge and understanding in the classroom and in the education system?
So before we move to others, Nicole, can you give us an example, of what is, this kind of types of assessment we should get rid of, and the one that you think actually will allow for, the possibility to actually really check whether people have learned what they've learned?
Well, very simply, if I give students a math or physics task to solve, and then they go ahead, or in English as a second language, and write a short essay about X, Y, Z. Then they can go use the GenAI tool, come up with the answer and hand it in. If I collect the answers by the students, I may just not know, I do not know who has used GenAI to produce the answer. However, if I give the task to a group, maybe distribute different prompts or maybe ask them specifically to use different tools, come together, discuss in class, and then come up with their answer. I will, and we've seen that, I will come up with different answers because they will come prepared with different GenAI inputs. And they will have sort of what we call the IKEA effect. They will defend their answer. They will have some ownership of the idea that they, together with their AI tool, came up with. And then we can see in the classroom, we can maybe have a presentation of 3 or 4 groups instead of 30 students.
Dragan.
Yeah, so this is really exciting, interesting discussion. And I think this question becomes, what do we teach? What do we don't teach? I would actually say one first thing, what we teach or not, with respect to when to introduce certain, in certain tasks, AI, and to assess students versus when not to do these type of things. We just finished a randomized control trial, which lasted for almost a full semester. On a weekly basis, medical students were asked to diagnose virtual standard patients. And they were gradually randomized into the groups. Some groups were initially introduced to use the AI assistants, while other groups were introduced to actually develop their own skills. And then they were combining the access to both of these, and eventually they were doing these things without. What we found in the introduction of the initial scaffold, so the students first developed their own skills, resulted in 2 things. Both they were developing better their own skills, and secondly, they were performing much better in synergy or in interaction with the AI assistant. The students who were using directly AI, they were basically barely performing a little bit better than the AI alone, or they were actually not even having any better performance there. So that basically just tells you that early introduction of the AI tool may simply confuse the students so that they don't appreciate the problems that they need to understand and learn. That's number 1. Number 2 is also many education institutions are wondering, what we are going to teach and everything. I'm going to go back to one of these famous memes when Jeff Hinton predicted in 2015 or 16 that all radiologists will be out of jobs in 5 years. And then Elon Musk, a year later, said that all cars will be automated in 5 years as well. And then there's basically, even today, radiologists are driving to their jobs. The problem is accountability. OpenAI is not going to accept accountability for the decisions to be made. We still need to have the experts and the professions in all our different, including software engineering. That's one important thing. The other important thing as well is, while there's lots of debate and to a certain extent like pressure that we need to develop certain skills, but let's go back to programming and software engineering. What we can do is we can definitely produce more code. But I was also reading recently, one of my good friends and colleagues, probably one of the most talented programmers I've ever seen in my life, who pretty much did our experiment. They said, yeah, we can generate and produce very large architecture and software very quickly. But then also that becomes almost unmanageable in terms of what we can do and evolve it and improve it. So in other words, we are just accelerating the problem generation that we already have, but we are not necessarily solving the existing problems. So in other words, while we can maybe tweak some tasks here and there, we still require significant amounts of the human expertise that needs to be introduced first.
Thank you. I don't know, Inge, if you want to, otherwise we move to process, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, process. I'll build your bridge to process then. I align with what everybody said, and I think challenge in learning is the most important element here. People really need to put in effort in order to learn. Learning is not painless. So generating stuff is not going to help you to actually learn and develop skills. And in order to be able to work with the output from a generative AI, you need to have skills and knowledge. And this is the point that Dragan already made. Without the skill and knowledge, and also what Ryan made, you cannot judge the output in a way that you can actually move it forward. And this is exactly the upscaling discussion that we're in. We need to develop these skills in order to be able to work with it. But it's very, very difficult for our students to do that, because the moment they see this output, the fluency of it, the process of it, it just gives you all these cues as a learner that, hey, this is super easy. You can do it. And they actually think they can do it. They can't. But the fluency of the output gives you the signal that, hey, this is very simple. You can already do it. Then there is a problem with the zone of proximal development. Oftentimes the output is beyond what a student can actually process. They cannot understand the answer. They cannot connect it to their existing knowledge and skills. And so what do I do when I don't understand something? It looks fluent, it looks good. I accept it. And this is already putting me in a space where I'm not going to ask the critical questions because it's too difficult to formulate the questions. So we really have to start realizing that the metacognitive cues that the generative AI responses gives to humans do not allow us to engage, or do not trigger us to engage in critical evaluation. And in learning activities, it increases the chance of accepting it and moving backwards, because this is too difficult for me to analyze, too difficult for me to comprehend. So I think we have to be very, very carefully aware of the interaction models that these LLMs are actually interacting with our students. And we have to be aware of the cues and the type of interaction that the large language model is giving to students. And right now, almost all models say, oh, that's great. They give you an output that you usually cannot interpret. And they ask, shall I do X, Y, and Z for you? And what is the easiest answer? Yes, please do X, Y, and Z. And we go into a dialogue where I'm just completely lost on the output. It looks good. I accept it. End of story. And I think this is exactly the process that we should start revising. And looking towards process data can help us understand and make students aware of their own process in this. And at the other side, and I think Dragan may want to add to this because he's done some great work on this, the interaction models of generative AI and the way that they're influencing human learning and behavior is something that we need to be very much aware of, because this is a very tricky process. Dragan, do you want to comment on that?
As long as our master of the ceremony is
Go ahead.
to intervene. Yeah, good. So no, absolutely, and thanks, Inge, for bringing it up. I mean, one of the key things with respect to that interaction is that people really need to think about what are those things that are actually capable to do in certain situations. So many people say, hey, all we need to do is now to teach or let students to critically judge the thing. But how can you judge something that, as Inge said precisely, you're not aware of how things are to be done? So in my view, I mean, there are multiple things that could be practically done there in terms of the leading us to the analysis of the processes and how we can use the process data. I mean, one simple fix without much sophistication is, but you pretty much ask us, okay, you produce an artifact with something, send me also all your prompts and give me that. So that doesn't require necessarily automation, but it's fairly transparent and it'll potentially add you a fair bit of burden. Obviously, that process of the analysis of these prompts and what was done potentially could be automated, and there are already emerging pieces of evidence, and we also see some of the literature that we can question that from the perspective what quality questions students are asking, whether they are actually asking certain important judgments to be made, certain evaluative questions, and so on. So you can actually see how students try to at least engage in some form of reasoning when they were dealing with that information. Then based on that, the teachers can get the insight, the extent to which students were really just blindly accepting, or whether they were also doing a fair bit of override of the things that generative AI is doing. So if the students are doing lots of override, woohoo! Sad evidence, though, is that majority of learners just accept it, precisely due to the reasons that Inge said. So then what we really need to do, and we spend a fair bit of time, is that we try to track what students are doing in real time. And then that's the work joined with Inge, and also Nicole is collaborating with us, and hopefully Ryan as well, is that we try in real time to track what students are doing and give them some prompts so that students can actually get more deeply engaged. So we say, hey, we are noticing that you haven't checked anything that you are doing this day. Consider these and these specific steps. So the system itself can potentially start guiding them based on that model on the feedback. The final ideal, kind of my dream scenario, is that we actually develop the models that are actually automatically analyze all these instances of the student's interaction with the chatbot, consultation of the different resources, and so on. And based on that, they can actually give us potential estimate of where the student is on the metacognition, where the student is on, for example, creativity, where the student is on their communication skills, and so on. So those are potential things that can be done. But at this stage, we are still into discovery. What are those processes? So for example, we just had a recent study which we found really interesting pattern. Those highly performing students with very good creative solutions, when they're engaging with generative AI, they're using lots of judgments, but especially in the loop and how they're coordinating these judgments with everything else, versus the students who are not really performing well on the creativity. They are just mostly accepting and not judging some of these things. So to me, that's really the critical thing. Where generative AI is potentially good in this case, can put the students in the more authentic type of tasks, and also doing all these types of assessment longitudinally. So not one big final thing, but actually regular continual types of assessments where we can track the development of the learners.
So what I'm hearing from you so far is basically that, we have to assume that people are going to use generative AI at least when they're not in a controlled environment, and kind of live with it to some extent, make sure that they understand that they have to use it in certain ways and not just outsource or offload their work to them, and so actually try to use it sometimes as a starting point for reflection, and to discuss, um, and also try to learn actually what the systems do, So that's because, in fact, one of the elements which really came in all of your comments were this idea of critical evaluation of the outputs of, these different tools, to be able to actually do that. So that's on the process side. There are two different ways of thinking about it. We basically, the kind of a portfolio assessment is one of or the process folio assessment is kind of the old way, and very much related, Dragan, to what you said, for the comparison with the athletes, basically looking at how you reach gradually a certain point, or how you actually make progress over time. What you're suggesting now is a different type of process evaluation, and we have a question from the chat, about the strategies, especially when we have large numbers of students to actually assess the process. And so here, what you're suggesting is more understanding the micro, the metacognitive processes, and which seems to assume that, people have to be in a platform kind of, so that to make it feasible. So could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Anybody wants to take this? I'm happy also to take this as well. So, I mean, to some extent, yes, Stefan, and I think it's a fair expectation as well that has to be done somehow in the platform, because we are actually dealing with AI, and the only way to engage with the work with AI is to use some form of digital technologies. So I think that's a reasonable expectation. So what kind of traces we can have? Obviously, like chat logs are really something we've been doing a fair bit, but we can also get a fair bit of insight. And I know Inge's team as well done a fair bit of work on that, is when students are typing. Based on these, just the typing of the whether written essay or writing of the prompts, you can make lots of inferences about how students are engaging into different cognitive and metacognitive processes, whether they are actually revising their prompts, gradually going through some of these things. So these keystroke bits are quite important. We also did, all of us in this room as well, a fair bit of analysis of the data based on students' clicks, what resources students are consulting. Obviously, there's a problem here of privacy, and that has to be basically very clearly indicated. What are the limits? Be very transparent about that, whether that's an ideal space, you want to kind of have it just in the platform, or get an explicit permission for students for only dedicated one or two other sites within the limited period of some time, right? So that's one thing. So you can get some of these other resources. Based on all these three types of data that I just mentioned, we can make really good inferences about how students are engaging into different processes of reading comprehension, into the processes of the different judgments, whether they are planning, whether they are monitoring, and so on. So that's the second part with respect to the use of the data. The third part is how we analyze these data. Is obviously, you can have the tools that can be used for that, and that requires a fair bit of expertise. But also there are people who are also trying to use the large language models to analyze all these traces. And while you may not get the 100% what Ryan Baker or Inge Molinar or Nicole Rummel would get as the great learning and analysts and scientists, they can actually get about 80% good results. So the teachers can get really good insights about the trends where students are going with this type of data. But where I would like to go ideally is we have specialized tools also that have all these little assessment tasks that are allowing students to do that. I'll just give you one final example, Stefan, before I let others speak, is we use this quite extensively in medical education, where we are trying to assess in this way clinical reasoning skills for students, where they are taking the history taking from virtual standard patients. So it's a really good environment. Students actually can get a simulated patient. They can also engage into the collaboration with simulated other colleagues, get advice from a mentor, use AI. We get all these bits and pieces of data. And at the end, we can provide pretty reliable type of assessment of their clinical reasoning at that stage. And the system alone is capable to do all these things so that both the teacher and the students can get these type of insights.
Thank you, Ryan. I think that I like to, you've been working on this platform GPTA, which, you have presented yesterday. Could you tell us a little bit more? Because one of the functions in some way is actually to allow to, follow some of the process and how students go through a course.
So GPT doesn't yet pay attention to process, but that's because of the design of it. So far, we've focused more on providing rapid, high-quality feedback to students that they can learn from and studying how they use that feedback kind of in their artifacts. But having said that, I think there's a lot of scope, and I'd go back to something Dragon said, GPTA, chatbots, other kinds of learning activities. Generative AI can now not only handle traces of conversation, it can actually handle the process data from fine-grained sorts of things. So we have a project at one of my doctoral students at University of Pennsylvania has a project where she's been taking the log data on what students do and formatting it in a fashion that both human beings and generative AI can read because it's textual. Having human beings label it and then seeing if generative AI can be induced to produce the same labels humans do. And it's able to do the same things a grad student can do in making inference about what processes. Now, that's not something, going back to what Dragon said, that's not something that teachers are equipped today to be able to do, but we could easily be, as a field, creating tools that teachers could use for specific learning platforms and activities that do break down those process data into a fashion that the LLM or a classical machine learn model can make inferences about with reference to categories that are meaningful for teachers. In a lot of ways, I feel like there's this literature on intelligent tutoring systems and student modeling that's been going since like the late 1970s and done so many things great. And it's almost like the world's forgotten that literature and the excitement about generative AI chatbots. But there's so much we can build off of there, and that field knows about how to infer self-regulated learning engagement strategy and knowledge and present it to teachers in ways that's meaningful. So I think that's one of the things I hope that we can do. is to bring together what we know about how to model students and support teachers with that information, with the kind of interactions that we're now seeing in all the vast variety of things we can do with generative AI. Not just chat bots, not just ChatGPT and Claude, not just Socratic tutoring, but also forum plugins like GPTA, and other activities that can be augmented in so many ways.
Thank you. So actually, these phrases, before we go to specific questions from the chat, this raises actually the use of generative AI to assess and do better types of assessment, so as a support for teachers to actually do that, So one of the things, for example, that it can help do is basically, the use of rubrics, these very kind of time-consuming things for teachers, but possibly. So what is your views on that, and what do you see as the new possibilities offered by GenAI? So as mentioned just by Ryan and Dragan, to actually assess the process and provide some kind of new information to teachers or to learners about how they are doing, but also perhaps what are the caveats that we also need to keep in mind when doing that.
I think one thing very important that came up in both answers by Dragan and by Ryan just now was the word teacher and educator, because I actually think that a lot of the analytics and the information we can gain on the learning processes, we have to keep in mind that there is still this, also mentioned by Dragan earlier, accountability. So there is still professional knowledge needed, pedagogical knowledge needed to decide what to do with the information. So I think we've talked a lot about the strengths, and there are a lot of possibilities, and you were also alluding to them, Stefan, just now, what generative AI and machine learning models can do in terms of analyzing process and providing information to the learner or teacher. But I think it's really important to see the role of the teacher in co-orchestrating with the AI. Inge and I are involved in a project, in the EU Horizon project called TAICO, Teacher AI Complementarity. And here we study very carefully how do the tasks of the teachers change in the classroom and in their education by working together hand in hand with the AI, by getting information. And we've seen also in other projects that I've done that teachers are indeed very careful in how do I use this information that I get from on the learning process to provide feedback and to provide basically decide how to proceed in supporting the learners in their learning. And I think the role of the teachers here, at least personally, I think cannot be underestimated, or cannot be underestimated. Sorry, I'm getting it wrong here. But the point is, it's crucial and it's important, because I frankly, and maybe that's where I have a slightly different view, I don't think that fully automated systems where the AI does everything, either we don't want that, and B, I don't frankly think pedagogically there really will be valid and will be possible, because that's really a crucial role here for the teachers. There is a second way of using AI that we haven't talked about, that is in doing something with the assessment that I have made, together maybe with the learning analytics, in relating it to the student. And there I see great potential, actually, because, these LLMs, they're very verbose, they're very, fluent, as Inge already mentioned earlier, and using that fluidity and relating my assessment as a teacher that I've pulled together from the analytics, from my own impressions to the learner, that is something where teachers are challenged quite a lot. And that's where actually I think GenAI tools have great potential.
Inge, I see you want to go ahead.
We still have time. I would just say that I would like to combine Nicole's and Ryan's point. I think large language models can really help students inquire their own learning process. Actual data about their writing, about their metacognition helps learners to reflect it helps learners to also think about how to do it differently next time, and the models can actually monitor their activities and help them actually induce these processes during their actual learning process, which is really tricky. This is a problem that we have been looking at for decades. Students know how to regulate their learning, but once they're in a learning activity, it's really hard to actually trigger these activities at the right time and at the right spot. So building these metacognitive skills to actually regulate your own learning process can be largely enhanced by using these different models. So I think that's an incredible opportunity, both with the dashboards, providing it back to students, but also including teachers in this. And we've been developing a co-creation project together with teachers, really using this data and helping teachers to think about new mechanisms in which we can make students aware. So that is one, setting goals, checking if you're actually doing this during learning, having the models interact with students, but also reflecting as a teacher on the larger process, but also building understanding in students using the collaborative efforts that Nicole is highlighting, having them discuss their activities together and trying to really make this next step. And this requires us to build in the old world and the new world. LLMs are fluent, flexible, and they have problems. The old world, intelligence tutoring systems, student models provide us with contextual information, gives us the student information we need. And if we were able to connect those two things in a meaningful way, then we can take the best of both worlds and we can really start making progress in this space. But it's still quite a long journey to go through.
Thank you. So what I'm hearing, and then I will have one question and we'll go to the chat questions. So, well, actually the reminder of the importance of having teachers who can actually make sense of all the data, but I also hear more use actually of in some ways, students using platform that would allow to better understand what, the processes are, but not just because of course, they also can continue to use the more traditional ways of, collaborative learning, talking to each other, arguing, etc. So, okay, we've been talking about, the use of GenAI in assessment in a non-control environment. So at this stage, it's when people can actually have access to it and what would be the nice ways of doing it. So very shortly, do you think there is what are the implications for, when people do assessment in control environments for exams, or does it make a difference or not particularly, and for the audience control environments are basically, where you can monitor what, there is a proctor or proctors and they can monitor what students are doing. Either they can actually give them access to specific resources or they don't allow them to have any specific, AI or do everything paper and pencil, etc. So who wants to say something about that? Perhaps there is no problem, and we just need to get on with how things.
Well, look, Stefan, I think it's a good question. I think many people are asking that question as well. From my viewpoint, always go back to the basics. What do you want to assess? What kind of skills you want to assess? And consequently, take the right type of assessment as well. In certain spaces, we really need to still, and I still argue, need to have some individual skills that are quite important. In these situations, we just follow the old-fashioned, common exams as well that are proctored exams, and people are doing particular types of skills, and that's quite important for many types of things. However, in these type of assessments as well, we can, and going back to some of the process data as well, we can assess some of the more interesting things now at a much larger scale as well. Many universities and school systems were claiming, hey, our students are great at critical thinking, global citizens, all sorts of things. Now you can actually produce some data as well about these things and get some level of evidence. We don't necessarily have to have for these type of things the rank order types of assessments that we typically have to have for the formal standardized types of assessments. What we can offer is this certain type of evidence that kind of looks across multiple types of dimensions and the ways how students are capable to engage with the AI in certain types of situations. And that basically also tells us that learners live in this kind of skill. So whether students don't like some of these AI or not, but it's a kind of the skill that they need to be prepared for. And therefore, I think that offers us really interesting opportunities to assess some of the other things that we often claimed that we care about, but we often didn't assess or have easy means to do the assessment of that.
Okay, so we have one question in the chat on 21st century skills, so give us an example of how these could actually be better done if we really wanted to take them seriously and assess them. Not you necessarily, Dragon, anyone can go for it.
I can break ice, but other colleagues
I
are
can
Nicole,
also,
please.
I can also point at the session at 5 o'clock where we talk about collaborative learning and GenAI.
Yes.
So certainly there's a way for interacting and having students learn to interact well by, it's one of the options, by the GenAI taking a role in the collaboration as a tutor or as a co-collaborator. So that's one option. I think for me, there's I'd like to talk about collaborative learning here. I'm sure that Inge, for instance, will talk about self-regulated learning. So on the collaborative learning side, I think there's two ways here for GenAI, two roles here, two potential ones. One is by matter of supporting collaborative cognitive engagement between small groups of students. GenAI can support in the process domain learning, so learning about math or chemistry. But on the other hand, it can also support the acquisition of 21st century skills in the sense of argumentation, collaboration, interacting in successful ways by being able to set up a setting where the students collaborate with an AI or around an AI.
Thank you. So we have one which is actually addressed to Inge, but I would have addressed it to you, Nicole, if it were, but we'll ask Inge to take it. It's about Vygotsky, and the theory of the more knowledgeable other, and to what extent actually could an AI become that more knowledgeable other. Inge.
Yeah, I think that aligns with the point that I was trying to make earlier. I think we can build tutors that do this. We've shown that in the past as well. And with generative AI, our tutoring, our dialogic features of the tutors are much more powerful than the ways that we did that before. So bringing in that connection with monitoring what students know, understanding their cognitive understanding of the domain, as well as their metacognitive understanding of the domain, and using that information to build this dialogue can indeed lead to a more knowledgeable other that can function in this way. So yes, it's possible, but it's also tricky to do it well. And again, that interaction pattern in how the AI is then engaging with the student and what would be a good interaction pattern. Also in previous research, there's really quite a lot of research on how tutors should interact with students, but it's still something that really needs our attention. And that brings me back to the earlier point. Currently, interaction patterns in generative AI can be cued by prompting and other ways of supporting the AI and instructing the AI, but it's still relatively fluid. So we're not capable of completely developing meaningful pedagogical dialogues in the mind and the understanding of Vygotsky. And I think this is still something that needs to be developed. And the question is, do we want to go there, or do we just want to develop this among humans and use AI for other purposes, which I think is a valid discussion in this space as well.
Thank you. We have one, I think, which is around the process aspects and what we can learn, and asking about, to some extent, what are you really able to assess when, for example, you look at, how people exchange with GenAI, and especially for people who, have a language as a second language. So is it a kind of a biased way? How much we can learn from that? So who wants to, so that's the question of language capabilities, language barriers for non-native learners, and how, if you really wanted to look at how people interact with a large language model chatbot, basically, how much of that you would pick up. Ryan,
So
go
if I
ahead.
could jump in?
Yeah.
I would flip this on the side and look at it instead as an opportunity for students who are acquiring a language, or who are not fluent in the local language of instruction. First of all, generative AI can support and scaffold people. There are members of my lab who came not really being able to write very well in English, and were able to kind of write great papers in English by using a combination of their native language and English, as inputs into the LLM, and having it help support them, having it help them find a word. So, and for example, our run code programming learning environment is run in Polish by LLMs, and there's no trouble to it. My colleague Ayaz Karimov and I have been conducting a research study looking at published articles across the many languages of Central Asia, and it works great for minority languages. So I would flip this and say, actually, if you just make people communicate completely in the local language of instruction with no accommodation, no opportunity to talk to the LLM in their own native language and use it as a learning resource, sure, that's going to be a problem. But if you instead say, okay, the student is an English language learner, say, let them talk to the LLM partly in Tagalog or any language, I think it can be an asset. So I think it can actually flip the other way.
Thank you. So we have a final question, and I will just raise it, and then I will ask you to make, kind of a final 30-second final, takeaway message for people. And the question actually, I think, highlights one of aspects we haven't really spoken about much, which is the more credentialing dimension of education systems. We've been talking a lot about learning, but learning for the pleasure of learning and acquiring knowledge rather than, having certificates or be part of, kind of a social hierarchy. And here, the question is, if students increasingly rely on AI for cognitive offloading, how should education systems redefine what counts as authentic learning and real competence? So I think that's a very, of course, important question. So you don't have to answer that one, but now I give you the floor for, kind of a final statement of 30 seconds. And let's start with Inge.
Yeah, thank you. Intriguing question. And I think it aligns with what I would like to say. I think we need to become aware that AI can onload and offload, both on a cognitive domain level as on a metacognitive level. And I think new assessment is really about trying to balance between the two. And in that way, also ensure that students are, in fact, intrinsically motivated to learn and understand how their learning processes develop over time and how that helps them become more human. And I really like to plead for team human in this space. Humans are different from AIs. Let's be proud of that.
Thank you. Dragan?
I'll go to fairly technical thing. The universities should not be awarding degrees that are basically kind of only based on the automation of the certain products. They should be playing for the humans, as Inga said. So human skills plus also humans and AI and the ways how they're interacting. And the other important thing is that the teachers in that process still play a huge central role. Inge mentioned the motivation, sense of belonging, the students with each other. Those are some of the key drivers why the learners are learning and why the universities and broader education institutions still play the significant role in our societies.
Thank you. Nicole?
I would like to say that education and education systems should enable learners to experience what it means to learn. And that can take different forms, as we have discussed. But I think we can find ways of how we can make that productive and find new ways with and around AI. And then maybe, as Dragan was just pointing out, rethink the ways we give credentials, not just based on performance measures, simple performance measures, but taking into account the process data that we have available and that we can look at over time.
Thank you. And Ryan?
So I guess my comment would be that we've always measured students on what they can do. And That's because what they can do has been a proxy for what's in here. To the extent that that's attenuated, we need to think about what's still in here. What are the important, we talked about 21st century skills a minute ago. What are the important second half of the 21st century skills for humans? And how can we measure those? That's the question we'll all be answering, all of us, over the next few years.
Thank you very much to all of you for a wonderful session. So we are reaching the end, and so that was a very engaging, and I think that this conversation will continue over time. So thank you very much, and for the audience, please enjoy the sessions on replay and the one that we will have this afternoon. Thank you.